Okay. Very happy to have somebody who I know can talk me through this podcast if I completely freeze with the storm that is rolling in, and that is Ken Ortiz of Calvary Spokane, the senior pastor. And Ken, I wanted to have you on for a while because besides the fact that I used to attend your church while I was in Spokane, and I've heard you preach many times about stuff that I have never heard a pastor talk about. Sometimes I'm sitting there, I'm like, am I on my YouTube channel right now or am I in church? I don't know. Bill Gates, Klaus Schwab, World Economic Forum. So I have to have this guy on sometime because I also heard too that, you've had some comments censored or deleted, or you've got warnings just to have a church live stream now in the YouTube world of 2023 is probably more challenging if you talk about the stuff you're talking about. So I thought it'd be a great time to talk to a pastor about self-censoring sermons or self-censoring pastors, generally speaking, and the church's role, the way you see it, in where we are today, I guess the United States in particular, but positives and negatives. So why don't we, I guess, first start with, when we're talking about self-censoring pastors, how would you define that?
Well, I think that people who feel like they're restrained from really speaking openly or honestly or directly about topics that deal with the culture. And I think that it was Martin Luther who said that if you're preaching the gospel and you don't tie it into what's going on in people's lives today, then you're not actually preaching the gospel. And I think that there's I think it's kind of a spiritual deception, a false teaching, if you will, that many pastors believe that it's not their role to have opinions about the politics or the events that are going on in our country. And I think it's a fallacy on several levels, but part of it is a failure to understand what politics is in its purest form. Politics is really the conversation you have within a nation to decide what are going to be the governing policies. And we've turned it into this idea of people who are running for political office. And I had this comment the other day when I spoke about something, and somebody said, well, I don't believe we should be talking about politics. And I said, I'm not talking about politics, I'm talking about morality. Because here in the state of Washington, our state legislature just passed a law in the last session, and we had a chance to get an initiative to vote on it, and it failed because we didn't get enough signups on the petition. But basically, the law states that if they decide that you're not allowing your child to get transitional treatment or an abortion, then the state can come in and seize your child. And there's no hearings. There's no, basically, a social worker makes that decision, takes the child, and you lose custody of your child. And it's left to you to spend the next 2 or 3 years in court arguing that they shouldn't have done that. And this is really kind of obviously an unbelievably onerous law. And yet, when I was saying we need to deal with this, again, people saying, well, we shouldn't be discussing politics. And the reason why this effort, the initiative, failed was because many pastors refused to allow petitions to be signed in the church. And so we fell 5,000 signatures short of getting it on the ballot. And to me, as I said, it's not an issue of politics. It's an issue of morality and the rights of parents. And I think the church should be front and center on those kind of issues in particular. So I'm pretty outspoken about things like abortion and transsexuality and all these things, because there are also things that I think that are clearly defined in scriptures as being evil and wicked. And I don't have any trouble pointing out that even though I may pray for our president's salvation, which I actually do, pray that he would come to know Christ, but at the same time, when he says many of the things he does, I just basically tell people it's wicked. It's just wickedness. There's no other way around it. And somehow that becomes anathema, and that Christians shouldn't say mean things about people, which, there again, Jesus called out Herod, and so did John the Baptist, and nobody censored them or criticized them for calling Herod a fox or calling him an adulterer. And yet somehow we've got this concept within the church that we as pastors should be silent on these issues that are defining our very nation and the world in which we live.
Okay, did you see this when this was going around? The Washington Catholic Conference backtracks from support of minors seeking gender reassignment. This was, I had heard, well, the original story was that they from Rance, Jason Rance, who's a radio host in the western side of the state. The WSCC is helping to stymie an effort to stop minors from receiving abortions or gender reassignment without parental consent. This effectively means they're helping minors seeking either medical interventions. In a letter, CC announced it's not taking a position on Referendum 101. The voter initiated referendum would overturn SB 5599, which you were just discussing, which allows the state to harbor runaways without telling parents where their minor children are located, so long as the minor is seeking an abortion or so-called gender-affirming care. In Washington state, they may receive either without parental consent. The WSCC's no position stance means parishes may not collect signatures to put R101 on the ballot. Their reason is nonsensical, leaving one lawmaker alleging the WSCC is intentionally trying to slow the referendum's momentum. And then they updated it to say that basically the faithful, we thank the faithful who have contacted us. Basically, people got, up in arms about it, contacted us and indicated their willingness to take action to support Referendum 101. We appreciate their advocacy for the common good. I remember when Brandy Cruz tweeted something about this. It said, like, we don't think it's going to pass or something. I mean, the wording was very weird. It was like, we don't think it's going to pass, so we're not going to let anybody sign anything at church. We're not going to get involved, and, it's politics. I'm just curious what you thought about that.
Well, I think it's unfortunately not just limited to the RCC. I think it's something that we're seeing across the board, even in the evangelical community. And it's really more of a, I was asked this question in another podcast I did recently, and they asked me why so many pastors were afraid to take positions. And I said, basically because they're codependent personalities. I mean, at the end of the day, most people who go into pastoral ministry have a need to be liked by other people. In fact, that's what a lot of people do. We're either narcissist or codependent or someplace in between. And I find that so many times pastors will go silent on stuff because they want to avoid controversy. Because the moment you stand up and say, this is what I think we need to do, you're going to get a negative reaction. And I did that with, our congregation, where during the election, I've never endorsed a candidate, but I said in the last presidential election, I said, it's a really clear choice. You got one guy who says he's going to do everything he can to stop abortion. That you got the other guy who says he can do everything to promote it. I said, it's really kind of a no-brainer that even though I'm not over the moon about Donald Trump, at the same time, I don't think anybody can deny that Donald Trump has a very strong narcissistic personality. Be that as it may, I think his goal in life is to be the greatest president that ever run the country in the world. I think that's his motivation for everything. And I said I would vote for Joe Biden if he would commit to ending abortion in our country, because personally, I believe abortion is the one issue that's going to lead to the destruction of this nation, simply because of what the prophet said about the offerings made to Molech. And I feel like as I look back over it, I look at the church, I see this lack of passion, generally speaking, amongst my colleagues and peers about the issue of abortion. Very few of them ever want to go out publicly. They ever want to put anything. I mean, I've written editorials in our local paper, and all of that stuff gets, a lot of blowback and angry people. But at the same time, I think that true Christians are looking for people who speak with a clear voice. And that's the thing, is it's not so much that they disagree as they don't want to be involved and have to deal with the controversy. In fact, on one of my blog posts, I wrote about cowardly pastors, because that was a term that was used by one pundit. And I said, I think that's a little harsh, but at the same time, I understand it. But basically, a lot of pastors are concerned about bodies and bucks and buildings, and they got boards that don't support them or are going to give them hardship. I mean, I've had board members who have left the church over the fact that I've taken some of the positions I have, simply because they don't believe that we should. And, it's like, it's not even a good, they say, well, I agree with you saying, but I don't think we should say anything. And I just find it it's very, very interesting to me at the end of the day, because if we don't stand for certain things, I don't think we stand for anything.
All right. Well, let's show people where they can follow you and keep in touch. You have a podcast yourself, and they can go to, let me just make sure I'm on the right screen here, calvaryspokane.com or kenortize.com, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And what do you tell us a little bit about what you do?
In terms of the podcast, or
Yeah,
what?
like what kind of stuff should people be keeping an eye out for if they like what they hear today and they want to keep in touch?
Well, Calvary Spokane website is a church website, and they have all of my sermons, my messages on there, as well as a daily devotional I do Monday through Friday. Basically, 10-minute devotional, and it's designed to help people kind of get connected with the Word. My personal website, kenortiz.com, is where I have more liberty to really tell you exactly what I think about just about anything. So I do blogs as well as regular podcasts. And in the podcast, I go into some detail addressing a lot of issues that I think are affecting us. And one of the things is that I personally believe that we are in the end times. And I think there's a lot of things going on in the world that support that conclusion. I've often said that if these aren't the end times, then I don't know what to look for. And so I try to put all that together into segments where we deal with the central banking digital currency, or the World Economic Forum, or these different things that people wonder about. And I kind of explore them and try to put them into context of what does the Word of God say in terms of the expectations we have for the last days. Because I really kind of pivot off what Jesus said, that when you see these things happening, look up, for your redemption draws nigh. And I think that I find with a lot of Christians today, they're not living in the expectancy of Christ's return. And in fact, there are many evangelical churches that tell us basically we shouldn't even give thought to that. So it's I have a very premillennial view of the end times, and I pivot off that by kind of connecting it with events that are going on in the world today.
What do you think is the ultimate consequence of a self-censoring pastor? What we started off talking about. What I mean, maybe there's several, but like big picture, where does it lead?
Well, I think the biggest problem is you begin to become more of a salesman than a proclaimer of the truth. And I think that it's basically, wetting your finger and sticking in the wind and seeing which direction the culture is blowing, and then you try to find the compassionate and sensitive pathway that you can go down to. And it's essentially what you end up doing is just kind of sprinkling fertilizer on the culture, because you don't really want to say to people that what you're doing is wrong and what you're doing is destructive. And so when you begin to focus on yourself and what you have to say and your views and your points of view, you're really sharing from a point of your own weakness and failure. You're not sharing it from a point of God's truth and his victory. So it's one of those kind of things that I personally feel like that if my personal opinions aren't supported by biblical view, then nobody should bother listening to me. Ultimately, they want to know, what does God think? And that's what I think that we as pastors are committed to teaching the Word. I think that when you get away from going through the Bible chapter by chapter, verse by verse, there's a tendency for you to preach on the stuff that you enjoy talking about. And I had a pastor one time tell me, he said, well, I just go through the Bible and I pick all the passages that deal with the love of God, and then I skip over the other ones. Well, I said, Paul said to preach the whole counsel of God, not just the parts that are easy to talk about. So for me, I would love to spend all day talking about the love of God, the grace of God, how good God is in my life, and the things he's done that I want to celebrate. But the simple fact is, as Ezekiel said, if we see harm coming on the nation and we're silent, then we're responsible and the blood's on our hands. And so I just feel it's an obligation. Quite honestly, when I really begin to, especially after COVID, when I began to really dig in hard on many of the issues that are facing the church and the nation, it was a wrestling match inside of my own soul. I mean, I would tell my wife, I said, I'm going to preach on Sunday on this topic, and this is the last thing on the world I want to talk about. But I feel like I'll be a sin if I don't tell people and warn people about these things. And so when you get, we all just, it's easy for someone like me to draw the conclusion that somehow the ministry in the church is about me, and it's not. Because basically all I am is a placeholder, and God will replace me in his own time. In fact, at my age, it may be coming very quickly, but the whole point is, it's almost like passing the ball on to the next generation. You're just part of the chain. And the thing I want to be able to do is come to the end of my life and say, I was faithful in passing the gospel on to the next generation and preaching the whole gospel, the whole counsel of God.
All right. I have a question for you in a second about why you think at the end of the day, I mean, you talked about codependency, and I'm also curious because when I look back on my old profession of mainstream corporate news, the vast majority, including myself, back when I was, part of the ignorant, I guess, about just the propaganda that I was peddling and being used for as a mouthpiece for the government or special interests. I was totally blind to it. But the vast majority of the people I worked with felt like they were doing a public service. They would have thought you were nuts if you told them that they were perpetrating evil. That they were just like fake news and they were part of some scheme to globally and have everybody eat bugs and all that kind of stuff. And they just thought you were nuts. So I'd like to know a little bit more what you think about, as you talk to pastors, when we're talking about avoiding hard topics or self-censoring, how do they justify it to themselves? Like what is it they tell themselves? Like how do they, give, for instance, like a journalist during COVID cheering on censorship when we were supposed to be the industry of First Amendment protection. I mean, you wanting to keep the First Amendment for the protection of speech and for journalism and the fourth estate and everything. And we saw so many journalists that thought it was a good thing for the tech platforms, still do. It pointed out, look what Elon Musk is letting people say on Twitter. It's crazy. Joe Smith, he actually tweeted this. Can you believe it? It has absolutely no effect on the United States or anyone in the world, but we're still going to do a whole article about it. We're never going to talk about anything that has, real consequence. And they really think they're doing a public service, and they're standing in the abyss between the end of society and people marching off the cliff to the Pied Piper world,
Right.
I guess a utopic world. So anyway, but before we get into that, Calvary Spokane only does grape juice. So if you're going to go get your wine, you got to go to AllisonWinePromo.com. They do grape juice for communion. So you're not going to get any wine at church, which means you got to go get some wine at AllisonWinePromo.com. 50% off the wine itself, 50% off shipping. These are all high altitude wines from Argentina. We got one from almost 9,000 feet right now, third highest vineyard in the world. They're extremist altitude. As I always say, if you want to be an extremist, but you don't want to go to federal prison, this is a great way to dip your feet in it. AllisonWinePromo.com. They're personally my favorite wines, and they just also happen to be a sponsor. It's a great way to show a company that sticks with me, doesn't tell me what to say, doesn't tell me who I can talk to, that you support their support of my work and bringing people like Pastor Ken on today. So thanks. And again, AllisonWinePromo.com. Let's go to that question before I take some other questions from viewers. So what do pastors like? How what's a self-justification? Like, because like I said, I remember C.S. Lewis saying, I would rather live under a robber baron than a moral busybody, fast forward to the end of the quote, basically because eventually the robber baron's conscience, you hope they'll wake up, but the moral busybody will continue torturing you with the approval of their own conscience. And that actually is more dangerous than the person who knows that they're doing evil, but just likes it. So what do they say to themselves?
Well, I think part of the thing we have to understand, I think we have a misunderstanding about people who do evil, that most people who do evil, in fact, I would say almost everybody who does evil believes that they're doing good. I mean, Adolf Hitler believed that it was a pure good, to cleanse the world of deficient races. And even Adolf Eichmann said, as he was awaiting his own execution, he says, one day you will thank us for what we did during the Holocaust. And so you have to understand that there's a certain rationalization that we develop. And in fact, that's, I think, one of the things that we underestimate about ourselves is our own ability to rationalize whatever we feel is in our own personal interest. And I think we live in a culture where we have defined the purpose of life to discover your own personal happiness. And I always like to remind my church that we need to always be sensitive to the fact that we are being affected in profound ways by the culture, profoundly more than we realize, and that we need to be really in the Word, and we also need to be really asking God to search and reveal our hearts, because the pressure to be happy is so intense in our culture right now. And the problem is that with the way we believe to get to happiness is by getting everybody to like us and approve us and to applaud us. So no matter how evil somebody might be, you're going to find that in many cases throughout history, the majority has applauded it. So even today in Germany, the German people would like to think to themselves that their forebears were just forced into following Hitler. But the truth of the matter is, the vast majority of them were highly supportive of his policies and reaped some initial benefits from those policies. It was only after we started dropping bombs on their cities that they began to question the policy. And so it's one of those kind of things I think we have to understand about our own sin nature. We crave this idea of being liked, of being approved. And you find that people say, for example, in the world of media, there's lots of kudos that comes to you when you take the side of the prevailing narrative. And so you look at it, you've got things like the World Economic Forum, the World Advertising Federation. You've got GARM and the government, and you start going through this list of all these major media outlets, like whether it be Facebook or Twitter or X, I guess now. Anyway, you go through all the different medias, and they're all promoting the same narrative and telling you this is the truth. At the same time, they're censoring out anything that's contrary. Well, it's human nature to say, I want to be on the side where most of the people are. And that's where I think that God calls us to a place of courage, where we're saying this may very well result in some negative consequences, but we have to be like, Martin Luther, who stood and said, here I stand, I can do nothing else. And that's a scary place, because he was surrounded by princes and prelates and all the most powerful people in all of Europe. And he's standing by himself without even an advocate or a lawyer next to him. And he has to give defense for what he believes, what he's teaching, what he's saying. And he very well understood that this may very likely end up causing me to be burned at the stake. And God intervened providentially. But the whole point was that kind of courage stands apart in every generation. And at the end of the day, I realized that you and me, we're going to have to stand before God. And I was sharing in one of my podcasts today that I said, I learned long ago that there's only one opinion that really matters, and that's God's. That I would like your opinion of me to be positive, but I can't make my decisions based upon what your opinion is. I have to make my decisions based upon what I know is pleasing in God's sight. Easier said than done. But I think it's a critically important issue that we have to reconcile ourselves with. And as I was saying before, that when I began to focus in on some of these issues, I found that I got plenty of negative feedback. I had people that walked out of our church, walked away, they stopped attending because they felt like I had committed the unpardonable sin, I guess. But the bottom line was, like when somebody said to me, what about the Democrat who's sitting out there in the pew? And I said, well, I hate to say this, but I think they should repent. I don't want them to justify their view. But, here again, it was like, I don't know. I'm not saying it was ever easy for me, because I sweat bullets putting these messages together thinking, man, this is going to draw some ire. And I was right. It did. But at the same time, I found that there was a whole lot more people who said, finally, somebody's saying something. I mean, we have people still showing up at our church saying, one parent said, we took our kids down to the Sunday school at this church we were attending, and we found out that the Sunday school teacher was a transsexual. And they're saying they're just stunned. And so they end up at our house to say, oh, okay, this is safe. And that's what we heard over and over again, that at least somebody is not afraid to say what needs to be said. And I think that's kind, because I wouldn't say I'm not afraid, because I've questioned myself many times. Do I really want to put myself through this? I can't tell you how many times I've thought, this would be a good time to retire. And then your conscience says, and do what? And that's why I found myself, I really actually do anticipate, considering the direction and the pace at which things are moving, that there will be a day, especially once we come to central digital currency, which is probably going to be launched a year from this September. And basically, I would not be surprised if we could no longer monetize the ministry. And that's just because they will have the power digitally to turn off the cash flow by pushing a button. And they're doing it around the world right now to different people that they don't like. And they're silencing conservative voices. And part of it is just like Dr. McCullough just had his whole business plan, just basically everything was shut down by Chase Bank. And so that's one of those things I look at, and I'm trying to get people to realize, I feel like my passion or burden right now is that I want true believers to be psychologically, emotionally, spiritually prepared to endure hardship as good soldiers of Jesus Christ. Because I'm pretty convinced that we're going to see that day come. Many Christians are going to be completely flat-footed, because when I go back to Revelation 13, what is the thing that really strikes me is that the Antichrist is going to enforce compliance with the one world government by controlling your money. You can't buy or sell without his authorization, basically the mark of the beast. And essentially, we are moving at such a pace internationally in that direction right now by the conversion of almost every major currency in the world to a digital currency. In fact, Australia you can't draw cash out of the bank anymore in Australia now.
Oh man, we were at Graceland when we moved from Washington to Florida. We went to Graceland, and there was I did a live stream in the parking lot about Elvis and the FBI. But anyway, that's what every normal family does, right? When they go to Graceland, right? The mom does a live stream about the FBI and Elvis. Anyway, my kids are going to be, we'll see. I don't know what my kids are going to turn into, but anyway, long story short, this lady from Australia, she drove up. She was like wondering what was going on. And we started talking, and she's like, oh, we'll keep in touch. And she handed me her phone and with her QR code. And I was like, we don't do that here yet. Or like, I don't want to do that. You know, it's like had all her information on it. It was like everything about her on a QR code. And I was like, no, it's real. It's like, it's right in front of my face. It was just crazy to see that.
Well, it is very real, and it doesn't get covered a lot by the media. But it's more real to realize that people are actually in different countries are actually being given cryptocurrency to go in and have their eyes scanned, so that they can have begin to do all of their financial banking and shopping using an eye scan. And for someone like me, I mean, because I've flown internationally and gone through so many different things, they have so many scans of my eyes. They're probably tired of looking at me, so I can't. There's no place for me to hide. But even with the airline that I fly most often on, it's they're going away from any kind of boarding pass at all. You just simply have an eye scan, and it identifies you, and then you get on the plane. So it's I mean, we are moving there so quickly, and AI and quantum computing is just moving us so fast. And even all these ridiculous hearings about controlling AI and so forth, that's not going to happen. There's too much money to be made, and there's too many powerful players inside of it, and the competition is too great internationally.
Let me ask you about money in the church, since you just brought that up. And somebody over on Rumble said that churches are built as business models now. Everything is seeker friendly, lest we offend the tithers. Thus, many pastors have exchanged their backbone for a false image of being a people pleaser. And then on that line, someone asks, G. Franklin, this is on Locals, isn't there a legitimate concern about jeopardizing your 501c3 tax exempt status by engaging in political advocacy? So I think that's a good topic to throw your way. And don't forget, if you want to support my work, $5 a month, AllisonMorrow.locals.com, join my editorial board, and then you get to put questions in ahead of time for interviews for people like Ken. So what do you think about that?
Well, I think that's one of the misconceptions that many people have, because what you're talking about is a thing called the Johnson Amendment. And President Johnson put this amendment in saying that if churches engaged in political activity, they would lose their 501c3 status. To date, there is not a single case that's been brought against a single church in the United States based on that amendment, because the IRS knows above and beyond everybody else that if it ever went to trial, it would end up in the Supreme Court and being thrown out as being a violation of the First Amendment. So many pastors are intimidated. They've been convinced that if they say anything that has any kind of political shade to it, that they're going to lose their 501c3. My whole thing, and I just basically saying that's a red herring. That's actually not true. And in fact, the law firm that we work with has actually encouraged us and said, please, if you ever get if they ever come against you like that, let us know. We will defend you. And it's basically the Alliance Defending Freedom, and they've won several cases before the Supreme Court, and so they know exactly what it takes. And they said, we're just chomping at the bit for the opportunity to challenge us in the courts. But the government, the IRS in particular, has been fearful of ever actually applying that because they know it won't stand the test of law. It's not constitutional. So for that reason, I'm not particularly afraid. But the other thing is, if I have a choice between following my conscience or losing my 501c3, I would hope I would follow my conscience, because I think in the end of the day, it's a mistake. But even in terms of the other comment about churches using a business model, all I can say is that's 100% accurate, because that's the whole idea that you look at the structure governmentally, even to the 501c3 and our own church, which has to have a board of directors, has to have different things that are required for us to qualify for 501c3. You look back that, and all of those have been ways in which we've allowed the government to begin to tell us how we should function. And I get the idea. You want a church to be above board, you want them to be financially accountable and all the rest of that sort of stuff. But the bottom line is that none of that is a biblical model. All of that is a business model and a governmental model. It was Grover Cleveland who said that the business of America, or Calvin Coolidge, excuse me, who said the business of America is business. And so that idea of business structure is part of the ethic of the American way of life. So any kind of time you organize something, you begin to have these Robert rules of orders, these kind of basic accounting rules and so forth that are used as the template in which to build that organization, none of which you will find in the scriptures. But keep in mind, the biblical model didn't envision the corporate model that we have today. And I think this is one of the great challenges that pastors face, because we have been so as again, I'd say, how does the culture influence our thinking and our way of doing things? That is one of the ways. It gets us thinking of the church in terms of a business model instead of seeing it as being the body of Christ. And there's no way to justify the business model based upon a biblical model.
All right. Let's go over to locals, get some questions your way before you go. One that I think kind of pairs with your background, because I wanted you to talk a little bit about how you became a Christian, how you became a pastor. Stoop Dog says, Pastor Ken, would Jesus be a Marxist? If not, what political party would he most align with? And you, I think, were like a Berkeley hippie, weren't you, before you became a Christian? So maybe you'd be good at answering this question. Were you a Marxist at one point? So would Jesus be a Marxist? If not, what political party or financial system or whatever do you think he would align with? And can you speak a little bit about your background too?
Yeah, well, I was a political science major at University of California, Berkeley. I was a hippie. I belonged to the Students for a Democratic Society, which is about as Marxist as you can get. And I'm certainly not a Marxist, and I certainly don't believe Jesus to be a Marxist, because I think if you study Marxism, you'll find very quickly that there's a lot of anti-Christian elements inside of it. In fact, when Marx basically said that religion was the opiate of the masses, and so he himself was very anti-religious. It's kind of interesting because many times, many Jews I know are really strongly anti-God, which is kind of interesting, which is a whole nother conversation. But I think that the thing that's really important to understand is that because of my background, because of what I went through and grew up in, my parents were almost John Birch Society Republicans over on that side. And of course, I went all the way to the other side and dipped myself in deep in that. And you just begin to realize that when you sit in those groups of people, the one thing that they all have in common is they're sinners who need God. And so when we try to think of Christ and his life in this world aligning with any kind of a political arrangement, that's kind of the problem, because the Pharisees liked some of the things that Jesus did, but he threatened their identity. The Sadducees agreed with some of the things, but he threatened their identity. The Herodians, you just go through all the different lists of all of the parties that existed in the time of Jesus, and Jesus didn't identify with any of them. He identified with the kingdom of God. And so I find it's interesting is because when you go on and look at today and people are saying, well, I was just going over this where Paul says, endure hardship as a good soldier of Jesus Christ. And any good soldier doesn't become entangled in the civilian work. Well, a lot of people have interpreted that saying that therefore as Christians, we shouldn't get involved in the civil life. And that's not what it means. It says we can't help but be engaged in this world. We can't exist in it without being engaged. But are we going to engage with it as the world does, or are we going to do it as God directs? And it's more about not being conformed to the world than it is, staying out of the engagement of the civil life. And I think that's kind of the issue, because it was actually Martin Luther King who, when he was talking about the issue of racism in the church in America, he said that what they've created is a civilized Christianity. In other words, if you wanted to be a civilized person, you would embrace this bigotry that was in the church. And what he was calling them to is saying, if you examine that view in the light of Christ, it may be a civil form of Christian religion, but it isn't biblical religion. And so I think that as Christians, we have to always be kind of examining where the culture is and how it relates or conflicts with the Word of God. That when I see the culture endorsing things that are good, then I need to be a proponent of that good. When I see it endorsing things that are evil, I need to resist the evil. And so for me, I was one of those guys who would march against racism, but I also was involved in other things that I'm really grieved about, because it was the promotion of lifestyles and practices and things that were clearly condemned by the scriptures. My only defense is I didn't know what the Bible said. I wasn't raised as a Christian. And if you'd asked my parents, they would have told you they were Christians because they weren't communists. But I didn't know what the Bible said. And when I gave my life to Christ, and that really came as a result of my wife's earnest prayers for my soul, when I met Christ, it was first thing I did was start reading the Bible, because for some reason I thought I knew I was supposed to do that, and that was shocking to me. I just suddenly realized that I was in deep weeds. I mean, I had a lifestyle that everything I was reading was saying, you're approaching life from the dark side, not from the truth. And so it just is a matter of reading the Bible, I began to change. And eventually I found that I had to repudiate most of my associations and most of my political views.
On that note, Alligator 57, Pastor, what are your thoughts about being welcoming to people who are far from God while ensuring the truth is known? I see confusion between caring versus agreeing with wrong, sinful behavior.
Yeah, well, I think it has a lot to do with a lack of courage, because you realize that when you say to someone like, well, let me give you an example. I'm on a flight, and I'm the last guy on the plane, just barely made the flight, come in, sit down in my seat, take a deep breath, and the young lady who was sitting on the window turns to me and says, "Hi, what's your name?" And I said, "It's Ken." She says, "Hi, Ken. I'm a lesbian." And it was one of those moments where I felt like God gave me just a quickness of thought, which is usually I have to think things through. And I just looked at her and said, "Honey, you are not a lesbian. You're a little girl who is deeply hurt by men, and you're looking for love in all the wrong places." And that young lady, tears started coming down her eyes. And she looked at me and she said, "What do you do?" I said, "I'm a pastor." She says, "I believe it." And we had a great conversation, because the reality was that I wasn't condemning her. I was just saying, you've misidentified yourself. And that's when you talk about people who are in the transsexual lifestyle, they are some of those most unhappy, miserable people. They have the highest suicide rate, the highest mental illness rates. I mean, their life is hellish, and they're desperately trying to find an answer. And I think the difficulty we have is we see bad behavior as being the consequence of being just an evil person, when in fact, most bad behavior is the consequence of somebody trying to figure out how to find happiness. And if you begin to understand that the person you're talking to has made lifestyle choices that in some ways were pushed upon them by their circumstance and by the world around them, and they don't know that there's any way out, that basically to be able to say to somebody, I don't believe that you're a man trapped in a woman's body or vice versa. I believe that you're someone who is looking for happiness, and I guarantee you the path you're on will not lead you there. And you need to come to Jesus Christ. You see, my big issue is, and people I get really kind of angry with are people like the political class right now who are telling people this is good and this is right. When they're calling evil good, I think we have an obligation to say, no, the Bible says that's evil. And you can't call it anything else. When the president stands up and says that, children, primary grade children should have the right to access gender changing drugs, or if there was such a thing actually, but they have access to these drugs. And I just told my congregation, I said, and the bottom line is that statement is wicked. It's evil. And you can't call it anything else because it's not said in love. It's said in political expediency. And I think that's the bigger problem is we need to understand, first of all, why people are making the choices they're making. I've never met an alcoholic or drug addict or substance abuser who said, I'm doing this because I want to destroy my life. They're doing it because they're trying to find a way to cope with their own pain and their own happiness. And that will lead them to some terrible behavior oftentimes. But at the same time, it's understanding what is really driving them. Paul said to Timothy, he said these people have been taken captive by Satan to do his will. And that's where I think when you begin to look at these people as being captive, they've been held in captivity and the devil has his hands wrapped around them. We just need to really recognize that they are the real primary victims in this whole story.
One thing I remember from my theological training was reading Exclusion and Embrace by Miroslav Volf. I think that's the name of the book. And he was writing about how, he has his family background in the genocide of Eastern Europe. And he was faced with this challenge of trying to keep his people from retaliating and killing the people who had come in and killed and raped them. Right. And he was like, it was never going to work to say to them, like, just live and let live, or it's all going to be fine. It's one thing if it's, you trip and fall or something, or someone steals some money out of your bank account or whatever. But like when he saw the horrors that they went through, he was really challenged. Like, how do you teach forgiveness and also justice at the same time? Like, how do these things hold together? Anyway, when I was listening to Timothy Keller's sermon on that, he summed it up by saying, there is a judge, like there has to be a judge. There has to be justice. There must be a judge, but it's not you. So that was what he said. I always thought that was very interesting. I mean, that's a deep thing that's stuck with me for a long time, is the idea that there must be justice. Like a Christianity without justice or religion without justice is nothing. It's but at the same time, like when we put ourselves in the position of the judge, then I think that's idolatry, I guess, or maybe not even self-idolatry, or I'm not really sure. That to me would be, putting yourself in the position of, so there's, I guess, discernment, like what you're doing, what you're trying to do, which is calling a spade, I guess, but not doing it in the position of putting yourself in the place of God, which I can imagine is it can be anyway. I could imagine that being a difficult line to walk if your ego gets in the way, or anything else, because there's a fine line, right, between being the person who's discerning the truth and the person who's playing God.
Well, I think the biggest theological error that we have today is the failure to recognize that we are sinners who deserve to be sent to hell. And the reason we're not is because Jesus died on the cross for my sin. And I may not have done everything that can be done, but I have had thoughts of things that, pray to God, I'll never do. I mean, we start recognizing the justice dynamic very early in life. The first time a kid says that's not fair, they've immediately created this dynamic that there are some things that are fair and some things that are not. There's some things right and there's some things wrong. And that's a reality that we can't escape. No matter how many mind games we play, we will always end up finding ourselves judging the behavior of other people. But what Paul said was, he said, we judge ourselves that we be not judged by the world, judged with the world. So judgment has to begin by placing it upon myself. I am no better than the person who is transitioning. I'm no less sinful. I have no higher standing or greater value in the heart of God than they do. And that's part of the thing, is that imago Dei thing, is the idea that everybody is made in the image of God. He created them, and that God loves every man and every woman and every child and every person. He has that same kind of love. And when you begin to apply that, you look at even things like abortion and say, God loves that child within the womb. How dare we arrogate to ourselves the judgment of saying that's not a life worth living, which is exactly what the Nazis said about the Jews. They're Untermensch. Their life is not worth living, and therefore we should remove them. And those kind of, people who oftentimes decry being judgmental are themselves extremely judgmental, because they're judging people for being judgmental. We can't avoid passing judgment. You know what I mean? It's the end of the day. I mean, it's kind of like people are going to look at me at the screen, and the first thing they look at, they're going to draw some kind of conclusion about me. I had a lady come up to me and told me one time, the first time I saw you, I hated your guts. And I said, really? Why? She said, because you look a lot like my ex-husband. Oh, okay, that's the curse is on me. But we can't help but draw those kind of conclusions in our minds, right? We can't help but come there. And yet the point that saves us is when we realize that the same judgment that I'm giving is the judgment that's going to be applied to me. And I deserve nothing except judgment. I deserve nothing but condemnation. But God so loved the world, and that world included me, that he was willing to perish on my behalf. So I think that that's really where, when we talk about people, there's a lot of people who are morally conservative, but a Christian conservative should be of a different ilk, that we're financially conservative, but that's not what we're defined by. We're morally conservative, but that's not what we're defined by. What we're defined by is Christ, and Christ's goal was to conserve souls. And so ultimately, if the things that I say and do don't add to the conserving of souls for eternity, then my conservatism is as worthless as the progressivism of Hillary.
Are you there, Ken?
I'm here.
Oh, you are? Okay, good. You froze for a second, but I think it was me. Let's go back. See, I told you, I knew it was going to happen right on when you said something about Hillary Clinton. You can't make that stuff up on my channel every time. Back when I used to do my wine reads and talk about extremism, I get booted out of my live stream. So I like avoid saying the word extremist, because if there is some kind of gremlin in my channel, they pick up on those words like, okay, it's time to get rid of Allison. When you said Hillary Clinton, then all of a sudden we froze. So, all right, let me try to get a few more questions to you before you go. What sent the alarm bells for him in regards to the employer attended the WF and sent out an email to all employees praising them? I really never paid attention to what they were until I read the email. It shocked me that a bunch of self-appointed people could make decisions for the direction of the world.
Yeah. Well, it's funny how you have to understand, first of all, on a personal level, the level of arrogance and narcissism that functions within people like Klaus Schwab or even Larry Fink. Because when you look at, say, an organization like BlackRock, an investment firm like that, and Larry Fink, who's the CEO of BlackRock, is one of the board members of the World Economic Forum, and who basically has $8.5 trillion worth of assets that really fund about 90% of the major corporations around the world. So that when you look at his push for ESG, really what motivated that the compliance was the fact that people like Target and InBev and others need that financing in order to fund and to expand and keep their businesses going, because basically their profits go back to their shareholders. How do they build new factories? How do they replace equipment? How do they expand their business? They have to go and borrow that money from investors. And that's where BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street become the three major investors who pretty much control the whole economic scheme of the entire world. So these people see themselves as being elites, but I tell you, it's really not about environment, sustainability, and governance. It's not about diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's about power and control. These guys that's what they're all about. That's why they're doing it. And it's amazing. I mean, they're good salesmen, but they control so many purse strings. That's what it really comes down to. Because that's one of the things I try to point out to people when you look at the book of Revelation, you always come to chapter 13, the mark of the beast. It's all about finances. You know, money is the thing that really controls the entire interaction and networking of the world together. And you control whoever is, someone once said, whoever controls the money controls the world. And that's really what we find it's heading towards. That's the goal.
Do you meet with like-minded pastors, like Brett Meador, senior pastor of Athey Creek Fellowship in Portland, Oregon area, for support and sharing ideas?
No, I don't. I mean, not that I wouldn't enjoy it, but I'm not familiar with that individual. And part of what I find is a practical challenge is time. And I do, you know, I connect with people digitally on all sorts of formats in order to really kind of evaluate and challenge and think things through. But that kind of one-on-one interaction is not something that's really, even in my own neighborhood, we have a group of about 40 churches within the Spokane area. Most of them are smaller churches, but who basically are on the same page, and about 110 to 200 other churches are not. But we have interaction between those churches, and they meet basically on a monthly basis. But for me personally, I mean, it's just a matter of function of time. I do a lot of this.
Yeah. 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 It's like kind of like my parents who are doctors. They always said, I'm not going to come home and watch Grey's Anatomy, you know? So anyway, all right. Plot Girl says, do you think some Christians have watered down sound scriptural teaching and hope to not come across as judgmental and consequently have gotten sucked into the worldly philosophies of the day?
Well, I think it's pretty obvious that has happened. I think what's more important to address is why it's happened. And I think that I explained to people when I first started pastoring the church, I said, I'm going to teach chapter by chapter, verse by verse from Genesis to Revelation. And when we get to Revelation, we'll go back and start again in Genesis. And I've basically done that for 40 years. And I said, the reason I'm doing that is because I want to model for you what I think that you should be doing. You should be reading the Bible from Genesis to Revelation. And what I find is that there is such a paucity of biblical understanding and theology because people don't know the Bible itself. So, you know, many surveys and commentators have noted that we are living in an age of biblical illiteracy. So the reason that that's fairly easy for people to do is because they really don't know the Bible. They really don't understand the scriptures. And I hate to say this, you can go to Bible college and you can take courses on theology, but you won't necessarily spend a lot of time developing what I call a biblical theology. And a biblical theology is basically when you read from Genesis to Revelation, you find that various themes and topics are repeated over and over again, and you get the full panoply of what the purpose and the plan of God is. Most people pick and choose, maybe they do a little daily devotional here and there, but they don't really ever have any kind of holistic or cohesive theological perspective. And so because of that, it's really easy to get them off onto these side rails that have nothing to do with true Christianity. It's easy to compromise. Well, as I said for myself, it was easy for me to live the life I lived before I was saved because I didn't know what the Bible said. But as soon as I started reading it, I realized that I had to make a choice. If I was going to follow Jesus, I had to choose to submit to a whole new set of rules. And that meant lifestyle change. And I think that to me is really the underlying issue is, yes, I see people doing this, but they don't understand the Bible. And I find Christians, good Christians, saying, well, I support Black Lives Matter. And I say, well, I believe Black Lives Matter. I believe that racism is evil and wicked. I believe it's not limited to just one race or one group of people in one place. And also, I think it's important to recognize that God has a higher plan and a higher calling, and we can see that in his word. And I don't know, it's a little frustrating to me because also that the BLM was a clearly Marxist organization that called for the destruction of the nuclear family. So, I mean, I thought that was a no-brainer, but I found that there were some Christians that said, well, yeah, they're not perfect, but, and I just go, if their very basis of their belief system is anti-Christian, how can we even sign on to that? And I just found those people didn't really know what the Bible said.
Or maybe also just didn't really understand.
Yes, absolutely true.
Okay, I have two more. Can you take two more questions?
Sure.
Okay. This one, just to sum up, is basically like SDB saying, what are your thoughts on Christians, particularly evangelical, who have a proclivity to just believe the media Western narratives of the day, whether it's climate, COVID, vaccines, Ukraine, whatever. And then critical thoughts like, well, actually, you know, for instance, the truckers in Canada were largely Christian. There have been a lot of Christians who have been pushing back on the narratives or some of the greatest losses of civil liberties over the last couple of years. What do you make of that?
Well, what I think is there's a great book written by a guy named Judgement. He's a Belgian. It's called The Psychology of Totalitarianism. And one of the things that he said that he discovered when he studied this topic was that in every country, there are 5% of the population that won't go along with the narrative if it doesn't make sense. But he said only 30% of them are enthusiastic supporters. The other 65% just keep their head down because they don't want to get shot off. And I've spent a lot of time. I've been to Russia probably 150 times ever since the wall broke down. And we did a lot of church planting there for years before they wouldn't let us do that anymore. We still support a lot of the works over there. But obviously, I haven't been able to go back for a while. But one of the things I found, I learned a lot about what it was like to live under the communists. And one of the things that was, I think, that was really interesting, because somebody explained it this way. It said, one night, in the middle of the night, you hear these boots running up the stairways to your flat, and you hear banging on the doors, and suddenly you're screaming and yelling, and then the boots run downstairs, and suddenly everything's completely quiet. And he says the next day, you realize that your next door neighbor's father isn't there anymore, and he's gone for the next 5 years. Nobody asks any question. Nobody says anything, because they don't want their door to be the one that gets knocked on next. And so many people just simply want to avoid being a target. And so they don't agree with it. And I find this with people all the time. Well, I don't agree with that, but I don't really want to say anything. Why? Because I don't want to get the flashback. And I think that part of the thing is that one of the things that Judgement said that I thought was really interesting, he said, as long as the 5% keep on talking, the totalitarians will never take over. But when the 5% go quiet, that's when they take over. And so, I mean, I thought about that. I thought, I'm determined to be part of that 5%. Because what happens is when I explain to people biblically why something is wrong and how as Christians we should respond, I find that many people say, you've just clarified for me a confusion that was going on in my head. And now I'm not afraid to say, this is what I think and this is what I believe.
I asked Dr. Judgement to come on. He was really busy. This was probably last year, so I need to reach back out to him. It reminds me that because he's
a great interviewer.
He seems like a fascinating guy. So I definitely need to bug him again. Okay, final question. Please ask Pastor Ortiz, what is his one paragraph elevator speech on the dangers of the WEF et al. To humanity, specifically in reference to the middle and lower economic classes?
A short answer?
Yeah, your one paragraph.
Yeah.
I've sat in the back of your church and watched the negative sign. It's like, it counts down how much time you have left, and then it goes into the negative, -10, -15, -20.
Yeah. Briefly is not a word. It's part of my vocabulary. I think that you have to understand, if I tell people, read chapter 4 through 22 of Revelation, and you'll see where the one world government ends up. And it's the people at the bottom who are going to suffer the most. So the World Economic Forum is not about humanity or welfare. It's about power and control. And that means that people like you and me will have to be eventually divested of whatever we own. I mean, the World Economic Forum states, right in their whole, their 8-point agenda for the future, their 2030 plan, was that there would be an elimination of personal property. There would be no private property. And when you look at that saying, well, the only way that anybody can acquire any kind of wealth or security, financial security, is to have personal property. That I have something that I can decide that I'm going to do with. And I think that you have to understand that this is about transference of all of the world's wealth to a select group of elites. And that's what it comes down to. So it's an economic forum for those who are wealthy enough to pay the $60,000 it costs to attend the forum every year.
Okay. Pastor Ken Ortiz, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. I'm just going to give the websites a shout out one more time so that everybody can follow you. You can go to calvaryspokane.com, or you can go to kenortiz.com, and that's Ortiz with an E at the end. Any final words? Are you good? You feel like you got it all off your chest today?
Oh, I can always keep on talking,
Right.
but thank you. It's been enjoyable. It's been a pleasure. And I just want to encourage your listeners, just keep on speaking up. Just keep on speaking up, because that's the best Western. As Solzhenitsyn said, live not by lies. And the Soviet Union collapsed because there were people like him and others who simply said, we're not going to pretend like we believe these lies anymore.
All right. Good word of encouragement. Thanks everybody for watching. We will see you tomorrow.